All right. Good morning, Andrew.
Yo.
Good evening for you. I've got
Yeah.
my coffee, and you've got your nighty night tea. Just posted uh, to Reddit, so we are good to go. Okay. Instagram is still not working, so that's fine.
That's
Um,
all right.
so today, the main goal of our live today is we wanted to come on here and just sort of break down a little bit of the kind of the discussion around lifting with a neutral spine or a stooped posture, a little bit of what maybe we don't want to dive into the literature too much because we want to keep your attention. And I know it's about a 2 minute attention span. So the thing, all of us in online, we're struggling these days with keeping our attention. But the two main points for the takeaways today are a stooped posture when lifting is found to be no safer than a neutral spine. So if I flip that actually, so a neutral spine has been found to be no safer or preventative for injury than a stooped posture when lifting. So you'll see a lot of, we'll show a picture here in a moment, but like OSHA, if you're in the States, or these organizations that are primarily involved with workplace safety and things like that are going to recommend a certain way to lift. And it's usually that squat pattern. And there's been a good amount of research that shows that the risks are really no different. So there's some nuances there, of course, and it's a big gray area. So that's always fun. And the biggest and most important piece is the second point, which is like, when does a neutral spine matter the most for you, and like what now? Because if you have pain, hearing about how a stooped posture versus a neutral spine being not really any difference in terms of prevention for injury when it comes to lifting doesn't really help you if you already got pain and injury. So we really want to kind of break down why it matters right now. So um, let me just grab a couple things real quick to
Yeah.
get going. But so far, what are just your first main points and takeaway that you wanted like to talk about today, Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's just so interesting that like the squat posture is like everywhere. Like even if you just see like simple packaging on like I don't know, a big box that or you might see like a little print saying, "Hey, lift with your quote unquote legs or whatever and don't use your back." And there'll be like a tick arrow and like a cross arrow, which I think Andy will be pulling up in a second as well though.
Yep, just tangled up in my cords. Yeah, let me share my screen. So yeah, Instagram didn't work, so we're just gonna close that piece of shit. All right, share screen.
Yeah. I think it's like it'll be good to talk about like the nuances of like when does it matter? Like we
Yeah,
can't just blanket statement say one doesn't matter and that's it. It's like we need some practical takeaways from that. All right, it's like when does
yeah.
it matter? And yeah,
Here's what we're gonna do. Yeah, I think that's the most frustrating thing for people too. Sometimes is like, and we talk about it all the time. For one person, things seem to matter more or less, and for somebody else, that's why that individual piece comes back, and the complexity of back pain is just, it's so difficult to say, oh, everybody should lift with a neutral spine, or oh, everybody should lift with more of a stoop posture. So here are the three different postures that this particular study looked at. Clearly back in maybe the when where did this picture come from, Andrew?
oh, I just googled stoop versus squat on Google and just that was like one of the first ones that
Yeah.
came up.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I was gonna say if it's from a study, it was a while ago. But here's a little bit, if you notice real quick, the squat pattern, like this particular person has their heels off the ground. This particular person has the heels flat. And so just some differences that I noticed right away with this one. But we have like a stooped posture, a squat, and then you would say this
Something
is
in
like
between.
yeah, like a deadlifty position. So um, now that we've sort of identified the three different positions, what can we say in terms of the spine position and the forces that are are kind of acting on the spine, like basically the main argument for why it doesn't really matter as much.
Yeah, I think like probably online you might bump into a lot of different people saying, "Hey, in a stoop posture, there's going to be a lot way more shear forces through your low back versus um a squat posture there."
And shear forces are just it's a force on the particular segment that might be like a back and forth motion.
Yeah, it's like if the two discs are like slide. It's like a sliding force motion. That's
Yeah.
what they're kind of looking at.
So if we look at some of the studies that point out um, in a particular, like, break down the study. I don't want to like dive into the studies too much, but we're drawing from studies that looked at even in a squat position or a neutral spine, they found that particular segments along the low back experienced high percentages of near maximum flexion, right? So, meaning like reaching anywhere from 25 to 70% or so of the segment's ability to flex or stay neutral. So the idea is that with just looking at the spine itself, seeing, oh, this looks neutral, that even at some point during the lift motion, it's experiencing flexion, which is what people argue that we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, so it's like even if we're trying to avoid neutral, you're wait, if even if we're trying to only stay neutral, it's like impossible because
Hmm.
throughout a movement, you're gonna be shifting the spine in whatever way just to like complete the movement regardless there. And that will just create some flexion, even if it's like small amounts. Or in this case, it'll be like like more than half of what it can usually flex in that range of motion anyway.
Yeah. So this idea about flexion being um, sort of injurious or like a loaded position inflection might lead to disc herniations was, not to go down the rabbit hole, founded by studies done by McGill and other researchers. And, they were looking at the levels of compression um, during that flexion moment, right? So their recommendations to avoid flexion come from, and I think a lot of people love to point out the fact that it was done in pig spines and not like human spines, but there's limitations on what you can really study in humans. So, um, you know, there's that. So in an imperfect world, this is where it just becomes so murky. But we'll make the argument for maybe the spine flexion here in just a moment. But if you look at some of these, let's see. I think the best thing to talk about now is probably how load matters too. So we wanted to come on here and talk about that there's a difference between like everyday tasks and maximum lifting. So, Andrew, what did you want to mention in different positions, right? So, like, imagine we're trying to avoid the prevention rabbit hole just a little bit, but imagine for a moment you don't have pain and or you've had a back injury in the past and now you're trying to prevent re-injury. So people might think, well, I got to keep a neutral spine, neutral spine. Why might not it matter so much for everyday tasks?
Just because the loads are like so light, right? If you're just aiming to fluff your pillow or just like make your bed in the morning, it's like a little bit of flexion will be fine because you're not moving much weight at all, and like the body is really strong, and the spine won't just like explode from you lifting up a blanket or something like that.
Hmm.
So it's like you shouldn't worry about causing physical damage in this position when you're just like fluffing your pillow or setting up your blanket when you wake up in the morning.
Right. Like if you are somebody that's, uh, I've read a lot of posts where people are like, I just feel like any next movement is gonna tweak my back. So like we're here, we are talking to you in this way where it's like if you don't have an active injury, and you're worried about re-injury, feelings of perception of like tightness or pain in certain areas, there's good reason for you to be fearful, because it feels unsafe. So here we are just trying to demonstrate that everyday tasks that require flexion haven't really been shown to be more uh, riskier than maintaining a neutral spine all the time. So we worry about people who are like very robotic, stiff, trying to move through their everyday. But of course, where spine position seems to matter is in the presence of pain. So when we think about symptom modification. So if you are, I kind of wanted to wait to talk to this point towards the end, but if you are somebody that is in a current flare up, it's naturally you're going to avoid certain positions that are painful.
Yeah, and
So,
I think that's a sensible thing to do in the
mhm,
short term, at least.
yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see. Um, you know, I think some people might swing one direction. So if we just talk about lifting with the neutral spine, and we were talking a little bit before about when does it matter to lift with a neutral spine. We just talked about symptom modification, but when it comes to heavier lifting and loading, um, we would say that there are reasons why you would want to keep a neutral spine, right? If you are in a squat position, you're going to load different tissues that are just a little bit more advantageous to how much you can lift. So, in that regard, right, what are some other reasons beyond that you would recommend lifting with a neutral spine? I mean, we talked about symptom modification, and maybe this is it.
Yeah, I think those are like the two biggest things. If you're aiming for performance, maybe lifting with specific postures will be more quote unquote biomechanically more efficient just because you're using different muscle groups to produce higher amounts of force to do whatever action you want to do. If you want to squat really heavy, probably smarter to and you have like, let's say if you want to squat really heavy and you have really strong quads and glutes, then you might want to do a little, you want to have form that utilizes more glutes and quads, and that
Mhm.
might look like a more typical squat for some people. And
Yeah.
then yeah, I
Y-
think
Yeah. So, when we talk about um, safety in lifting and technique, I think that's our biggest thing. And I'm kind of getting lost a little bit, my ramblings here, which is very common. But our biggest takeaway is lifting with a neutral spine, right? There hasn't been any research or evidence to show that lifting with a flexed spine is a stronger position, right? So I can see, right, when we are making the argument against spinal flexion and lifting. If you don't have a history of injury, it's an okay position. And our point is that it's an okay position because it's no less riskier, or nor more riskier rather, but it's not necessarily a stronger position. Did that make sense, Andrew? Check me on
what did you mean by
that.
flexion is more not more stronger than like
Yes. So just back to the lifting position, meaning like lifting with a flexed spine versus like lifting heavier weights. Like you won't. It's not an advantageous position of power production or
yeah,
strength
yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah, yeah. Because I think
So,
yeah, there's like good examples. It's like if for strongmen or whatever, they have to lift boulders or weird shape rocks or whatnot.
mhm,
So it's like they do use a lifts. They do use like a quote unquote curved spine to just like
mhm,
lift up the rock. Just because you can't really lift it up very well if the rock's really far in front of you and you're trying to do like a perfect squat pattern there.
yeah,
So you can be really strong in many positions.
mhm. So, I think some people would make the argument about like higher risks for disc herniations as well in the stoop posture. So if we look at the number of like the percent of disc herniations seen in people with back pain, it's a much lower I think, than many people realize. But then also, if you look at the percent of disc herniations that come from heavy lifting, it's also much lower than people realize. So people with back pain, it's somewhere between 2 and 5% of people will have a disc herniation that might be the root cause of their symptoms, and then it's somewhere around 7 to 9% of people who have disc herniations that would say it came from heavy lifting. So if these things are going to exist outside of heavy lifting, and we haven't found that for everyday activities a stooped posture is at a higher risk of injury, then we can make the argument that even uh, in the presence of pain, getting back to tolerating a stooped posture position could be beneficial.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me, it's like what I'm thinking is people mainly get injured from things that they're not prepared to do. And if you're constantly avoiding rounding your back, then the slightest amount of rounding might cause a flare up, or you just might be really, really sensitive to doing that. So it's like maybe you want to introduce some form of flexion once you're no longer in a like sensitized state or when you're no longer flared up. And then you can slowly practice that more and more in different ways just to get, I guess, quote unquote, get used to it or practice that thing, when you do feel safe and you're not in pain. And that kind of like gives you evidence that's like, hey, I can bend my back to pick up a pen or put on my socks in the morning and I'll be fine.
Yeah, so fear of flexion, and then which is derived from flexion based pain, perhaps, or being told flexion is bad. So that's like like why we come on here and kind of rant about this, because it matters, right? So if somebody tells you never to flex your spine after pain and injury, and you go around your entire life never flexing your spine, there will be a moment where you have to flex your spine. And the case in point is, in this position, it's like, even in these more what appears to be neutral, you're experiencing flexion. So there are different positions. Always working with a medical provider, movement provider, that somebody can show you how to ease back into these positions, or move in a way that's unique to you and your circumstances, I think is always the recommendation. So I hope we were able to summarize the last couple minutes why it's okay to have a stooped posture when lifting, why it might not matter as much because you can get injured even with the neutral spine, and that if you have fear around a particular movement, it could continue to perpetuate pain cycle, which can be self-limiting. So is there, we didn't really talk about playing sport, and if you have a sport that requires spine flexion. I mean, we did talk about strongman a little bit, but if somebody's listening to this and they're like, well, I don't play sports, I don't do strongman, I don't do heavy lifting, um, what's maybe a couple, we already talked about takeaways, but is there anything else you want to add to that?
Or in what way?
I just, maybe if there was anything else that came to mind that I mean, for example, like I think sometimes people will say, "Are sit-ups bad or good?" Somebody will come on Reddit and they'll say, "Sit-ups are bad," and people will say, "Never do sit-ups; they're really bad for your back."
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. I think that's right. It's like stooping and squat form postures, neither is bad and neither is quote unquote the right way either. It's like
Hmm.
they're just different ways of moving and it's kind of lives on a spectrum. If you need to round your back more, then like you'll look like you're doing more of a stoop pattern. But if
Hmm.
you just have to do something when you can squat more, then you'll just be doing a more squatty looking pattern. And
Hmm.
it's just they're just two sides of the spectrum where you're quote unquote use biasing more usage of like the glutes and quote unquote quads versus just a more back focused movement. And that's fine if it's back focused.
Um, so like when people say never do sit-ups, McGill has a modified looking sit-up, right? Where if you're laying on your back, it's like a curl up.
Yeah, curl up. It's like just lifting your shoulder blades off the floor, something similar to that.
Yeah, and that ends up working like the abdominals. I think that's a great workaround for people, but I think if you're somebody who has done sit-ups, or if you're a gymnast, you're going to have a lot of, during the kipping motion, a lot of dynamic um, spine flexion and things like that. If you're somebody that used to be able to tolerate that position and then get injured, and at the moment spine flexion is bothersome, it's okay to probably gradually get back into, you know, it's just frustrating because it kind of goes back to this idea that like we can't demonize one position, and I think that's a good takeaway from just right there. The
Yeah.
other the other point I wanted to shift was if we looked at general recommendations at like the workplace where they say avoid stooped and do some sort of squat, I think we would see less workplace injuries, right?
I think there's like some research done from down in Victoria in Australia. It's like they said something along the lines of the incidence rate does not improve. Wait, the incident rate of injuries do not improve with teaching people this squat pattern. And there's a chance that you might hurt more people because if people get hurt from not being prepared in a specific way, then if they go from like a more stoopy lifting style to a squatting lifting style, then now they're kind of using these muscles that they haven't used before, and
Hmm.
that might increase the risk of injury. So that
Right.
also shows like the evidence there is like really gray. It's like, oh, we're not too sure if like doing this thing actually reduces injury rate or not, and it's looking like it doesn't. And there's probably way more factors to go on with it there.
Yeah. So essentially, this is the article you were referencing. Why do we
Mm.
still use how to lift training when we know it doesn't work? So, um, just a kind of an interesting, it's like, well, these guys on the internet are telling me it might not really matter. And I go to work and, the
My employers are saying I have to do this way of
right,
lifting because they literally taught me in training.
right. So I kind of felt like that was an interesting point to take. So, um, those, that's pretty much all that I felt like coming on to say. We try to keep these a little bit shorter, even though we're going on 25 minutes here in a moment. But um, in essence, in to recap, um, the positions that you're prepared for are like if you're somebody that lifts in a stooped position frequently, different weights, and those are ranges of motions that your joints often experience. It's not any riskier to do that just at the outset than another position, as why maybe kind of Andrew is referencing the how to train on how to lift at work. I mean, it's the point that you made was perfect. Is like if you're not somebody that is often using your hips, maybe your back is stronger. I mean, I saw somebody one time who like without their shirt on, they're basically the straps on their low back, they're like hypertrophied because that's all they did, and how they were taught to lift was actually the stooped pattern. So for them, squatting was actually, this was at the gym, so it wasn't a pain and injury case, but it was somebody who was having trouble with the squat pattern. So we find ourselves back into a gray area of stooped position is not inherently bad, neutral is not inherently better, but you can make the arguments for both. And so I think if you have pain right now, it's often a good idea to work with somebody who can help you explore different positions, because we don't want you to be walking around even fearful of particular movements, often creating more stiffness and potentially keeping you in like a pain cycle. So That was a terrible summary, but this is
Yeah,
the best.
I think my little takeaway is stoop versus squat, neither is bad. If you end up practicing both in whatever way and you're prepared to do both and you're no longer fearful of doing either, then that might give you more access to doing more things in life and you're able to do more movements
Yeah,
without overthinking it or whatever. Yeah.
yeah. And for people who are like, well, every which way I move hurts right now. Um, your tolerance is just super low, and it's really difficult to give blanket recommendations for somebody in that position. I mean, sometimes we can come on and people are sending a picture of a movement or a position, and we can make recommendations blanketly, but finding a good movement provider who's not just going to, I think massage and dry needling, even chiropractic work or manipulations like can all have their time and place, but they're not going to prepare you really for loads and demand on the body. So that's just another soapbox, but um, really finding a provider who can help you explore these positions is probably the best recommendation.
Yeah.
All right. That's all we got for today. So we're going to continue to try to do one live a week where we bring on certain topics. And if you catch us at the right time, you can ask questions. I've been taking a peek at the live chat. Nothing's popped up, but no surprises. So until next time, I'll see you.
All right.